Thank you so much, Ambassador Siddiqui, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, when we look out at our political and social landscape, quite often the future looks bleak. And if there's anything that's been describing the United States in the past couple of years, it's been hate. Over the past few years, hate-filled groups have emerged on the scenes, from the white nationalist movement, the international white power movement, anti-Black racists, Islamophobes, anti-Semites, and the list goes on. And the disturbing truth is that this has been amplified, normalized, and increasingly institutionalized here in the United States and throughout the world. It's not just attacks on famous individuals, for example, on Representative Ilhan Omar, who was Black and a former refugee and has endured a campaign of hate and defamation, even having her life regularly threatened. But go to the average Muslim American student, child. 1 in 4 Muslim children has been the victim of bullying in the past few years. According to the FBI, there has been a 17% increase in Islamophobic hate crimes every year for the past 5 years, a 17% compounded increase. And this has been consistent in the past couple of years, stating, according to the FBI, that this has been one of the most anti-Muslim time periods in American history. Attacks on mosques are often the symbols that we use to measure Islamophobia. Have there been attacks on mosques? But this is quite limited. Beyond just the desecration of mosques, increasingly the attacks have been on individuals, members of the Muslim community, women who wear headscarves, or Sikh men who wear turbans, mistaken as Muslims. And when we think about the attacks on the symbols of Islam, these symbols, mosques, headscarves, turbans, the attack is not just on the individuals. The attack aims to dehumanize. And that's what we're talking about today, the dehumanization of Islam and Muslims, how it happens and why it's so predominant. Today, it's predominant in everyday political discourse. Think about what we saw in the past 5 years. Nationwide anti-Islam rallies, controversies surrounding mosque zonings, the illegal surveillance of MSAs, attempts to pass anti-Sharia legislation in the run-up to an election in 24 states, the arrest of young people with nothing other than, for example, a boy with a clock, the vitriol that came out of the 2016 Republican primary that fed into what we're talking about today. It seems that the language around Muslims being trusted as American citizens continue to rise. And according to Gallup, 48% of Muslim Americans say that they have experienced racial or religious discrimination in this time period. And unfortunately, we have seen the end result of this. We've seen the execution-style murders of 3 young people in North Carolina, the burning down of an Islamic school in Houston, and when 2 young people were asked in Michigan if they were Muslim and they responded in the affirmative, they were stabbed repeatedly. And just a few blocks from my university, when a Muslim man was asked, "Are you Muslim? Are you Arab?" and he responds, "Yes," he was repeatedly stabbed in front of his wife and child. Political campaigns, including language that, for example, the United States is a Judeo-Christian nation, indicating that Islam has no presence here, or that Muslims can't be trusted, or that Muslims should be excluded from political positions, cabinet positions, especially in the last administration. Essentially, there were several individuals in the run-up to, not the last election, but the one before that, that were talking about a country, our country, that should exclude Muslims from the definition of what it means to be American. I remember seeing this come firsthand in 2015. 2015, during President Obama's State of the Union address, when he states the United States is a nation that will not tolerate anti-Semitism. Now, of course, the entire congressional body stands up and applauds, rightfully so. But in his next breath, he says the United States is also a country that will stand against rising Islamophobia. And much of the chamber remained silent. But we as Muslims heard this loud and clear, that our elected officials are starting to agree that what was once marginal is now becoming mainstream, and that is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is defined as the unfounded or irrational fear towards Islam and Muslims that perpetuates negative stereotypes. But it's not just that. It's not just the irrational fear. There's actually a political objective, and that's the marginalization of Muslims from social, political, and civic life. There's an end goal here. And it's this irrationality that we talk about most often in the literature. For example, there's a certain talk show pundit on a certain cable TV channel that for many years, up until that election, would say that 40% of Muslims throughout the world support terrorism. Now, what does that mean if there's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world? That 640 million of them would have to be supporters of terrorism. But if you think the populations of these countries, Tunisia, 1 million, Morocco, 33, Libya, 6, Jordan, 6, Indonesia, 250 million, Malaysia, 30 million, Pakistan, 193 million. Add to that the 172 million Muslims in India, every single one of those people in every single one of those countries would have to be a supporter of terrorism for that one falsehood to be true. While we know those are all people who live and vote in democratic countries vying for democratic openness. And so it's this kind of falsehood that we need to highlight to say, what does this perpetuate? What does it propagate? We tend to think that this is a post 9/11 phenomenon. The question of, well, what about the Muslims, unfortunately, is not new. It's been with us. Think about the biography of the Prophet, the bestseller by Washington Irving in the 1840s, or Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, talking about promoting stereotypes of Islam and Muslims. The first silent film, Rudolph Valentino's The Sheik. The entire film industry and its role. But what do we know about Muslim Americans, their legacy in this country, their contribution, and where they are today? On the East Coast where I live, 20,000 Muslim physicians on the front lines battling COVID. They are frontline workers, frontline responders, driving taxis, feeding people on the street, heading banks, hospitals, fixing teeth, paving roads. Muslim Americans, where I live in New York, both died on 9/11 and helped erect the first steel beam of One World Trade Center today. Muslim Americans have been part of the very fabric of this country. In 2007, a book written, Muslim Veterans of American Wars, chronicles how many Muslims fought and died for this country since the Revolutionary War. Yes, there were Muslims in the Revolutionary War who fought in the War of 1812 and the Civil War and World War I and World War II, Korea and Vietnam, the Gulf War, and even the current war on terror as Americans for America. Muslim scholars, Muslim women scholars, 20% of the women that were brought as slaves from Africa were Muslim women scholars who helped build this country while also preserving their Islamic identity and their language and their skills were deemed illegal. We think about what this all means for the way we think about the legacy of Islam in America. Why is all this relevant? Do you remember when President Obama was candidate Obama and he was running for office? There was a question being circulated about his middle name and whether he was Muslim, which led to a deeper question of, can a Muslim be president? If you remember this time period. Now, this wasn't the first time this question was asked. In 1788, William Lancaster, a delegate in the North Carolina Convention to ratify the US Constitution, projects his fear about the future of this country. And he says, and I quote, "Let us remember, we're forming a government for millions not yet in existence. I do not have the art of divination in the course of 400 or 500 years. I don't know how it will work." He's very fearful about the future of the country and what the Constitution is going to lay out. He says, "I don't know who's going to occupy that chair." That chair he's talking about is the presidency of the United States. A Mohammedan might take it. A papist might fill it. I see nothing against it. What he's talking about in this great debate over the ratification of the Constitution of the United States is about the future of this country and whether a Muslim could be president. And what's unique about this moment is in US constitutional history, we're talking about Muslims being the symbol of the definition of what the future of America is going to look like. And so what this definition is, it was about the big litmus test of whether only a Protestant male could be president. And so this debate leads into a conclusion over days of fierce negotiation of that, no, indeed, there will be no religious litmus test, making the Federalists actually defend the future possibility of a Muslim president. Think about it. Why, in spite of everything that happens in this country, rising hate, do you see people, the average American, still come to the forefront and defend the average Muslim American? It's because this fundamentally goes against the fabric of American society, the ideals that this country was founded on. However, since the past couple of years have passed, we know what the data tells us. According to Gallup, 86% of Americans see Muslims in a negative light, or they have a negative association with the word Muslim. And that is worse than 1 week after 9/11. And this is because those very American values have come under attack. It's led to a country that's building identity on an exclusionary framework. And the inclusion of Muslims would actually mean to redefine what it is to be American. And so this can't happen. And this language continues to happen. But what does this all do to the average young Muslim American who constantly finds their identity constructed for them? When they are told, you are not us, then they're constantly reacting against frames that are inherently irrational and against the history of this country, against the legacy of Islam in America. But we're limited by those frames. But what we can't do is continue to define ourselves against those irrational frames. When we're stuck constructing our identities against irrational frames, we actually limit what it means to be Muslim and what it means to be American. And that means Islamophobic rhetoric has been working. When we think about what it means to be Muslim in America today, what it means to live with this legacy of contribution, we know that Gallup released a study back in 2009 and has renewed it a couple of times since then, that finds, and it was groundbreaking at the time, that Muslim American women are the most highly educated, second most highly educated religious minority group, and that Muslim Americans are the most economically stable. Muslim Americans have the highest degree of economic gender parity, meaning Muslim women earn as much as Muslim men. But statistically speaking, Muslim Americans are productive, educated, and civic-minded individuals. And in their most recent study, Gallup finds that Muslim Americans are the staunchest opponents of violence, especially attacks on civilians, compared with every other religious minority subgroup. My colleague at the University of Seattle conducted a study that finds the more mosque-going you are, the more an individual attends mosque, the more they're in tune with what's happening in the community, the more civic-minded they become, which means there's a positive correlation between Muslims being engaged in their local mosque and Muslims being civically engaged as Americans. My former advisor at Princeton University, just down the road here, released a study that finds the more you understand the Quran, the more pro-justice you are, the more pro-justice for all. Meaning that Muslim Americans not just have a historic legacy, a constitutional defense, but also a long legacy in this country of civic-minded giving back that stems from their religion. But knowing all of this, how does it affect? When we think about the Islamophobia industry, the birth of the Islamophobia industry, $50 million a year to tarnish the image of Islam and Muslims as anti-West and anti-woman and anti-Semitic and anti-justice and angry and anti-everything. What this means is that youth are constantly reacting to those irrational frames, that the odds are stacked against them, and that this industry, that's a marriage of pundits and financiers that benefit from the electoral cycle that ensures that those that run on fear make it into office. And unfortunately, we saw this happen in 2010 midterm election, 2012, 2014, and 2016. I have a study that tracks how hate speech through this industry actually allows elected officials from the rise of the Tea Party to run into office and win, and then those issues fall by the wayside. If you remember in 2010, there was a hysteria in New York around a so-called Ground Zero mosque, this monument that Muslims were building, a victory mosque. Neither was it a mosque or was it at ground zero. But the hysteria of that summer leading up to an election actually allowed elected officials running against that narrative to win their seats in office. And as soon as the election is over, what happens? The hysteria is over. 2 years later, we saw it with the anti-Sharia legislation to be passed in over 24 states. It was never about the legislation getting passed. It was about creating hysteria around Islam and Muslims that people running for office could ride it in. And that's what happened. And as soon as the election is over, there's no more talk about anti-Sharia legislation. What this means for us is that there are these frames that are illogical, that are full of fear, that young people instinctively find themselves responding against, shaping how they identify in this country. Because when you feel like you're told that you don't belong, you actually might start to believe it, even though you don't think you belong anywhere else but here. But one thing that has been shown to us in the past couple of years is all is not bleak. We have seen the explosion of people running for office, 93 people in the last election running for local, federal, and state office. We see the rise of young people moving into industries, trying to change the narrative. Youth becoming the great equalizers who are writing their own stories. They're WhatsApping and posting and tweeting and retweeting and Gchat, checking in and blogging and YouTubing and vlogging and all the other social media things that I don't know about. They're speaking a language that in many ways knows no bounds. And so when we talk about the Islamophobia industry, it is these people that are the great equalizers. And one fundamental project of the American Muslim institution is creating a space for young journalists, a platform, not just for them to come together, but for their voices to be amplified. Imagine young Muslim American journalists who are working on stories that transcend what are technically Muslim issues, but are issues that touch American lives, the American narrative, having their voices amplified. When we think about what this all does, this is the great equalizing against the Islamophobia industry. Supporting projects like this that amplify Muslim voices are actually the great equalizers against the $50 million a year Islamophobia industry that's grown to be $1 billion industry that is well-funded, unregulated, and continues to foment fear and anti-Muslim irrationality. When we think about what this ultimately does to the position of Muslim Americans know today that their story is tied to the story of everyone else, that their lives won't matter until there's justice for all lives, that we can't talk about a just society when it's just our community, but it means going into the inner cities, breaking the boundaries of privilege and saying that we can't fight for Muslim rights until we fight for the rights of all, for ending mass incarceration, equal education, access to affordable housing. That these stories that young Muslim Americans are putting forth today are the great equalizers, and their narratives exist both within and outside of the Muslim community. And it's this generation, through projects put forth like this one by the American Muslim Institution, to support Muslim American journalists, to give them a platform to amplify their voices, that says to this generation that when society says this generation is the lost generation or the millennial generation that's self-absorbed and taking selfies, that no, indeed, they are the great equalizers. That this professional class of young Muslim Americans is not just writing their stories, but they're ensuring that our stories are no longer written for us. As Muslims, we know that the Ummah is one body. And when one part of the body hurts, the entirety of humanity suffers, or so we're told in this relation. We think about the parts of the world that hurt, or the parts of the body. We tend to talk about Rwanda and Darfur and Ethiopia and the Congo and Kashmir, that these are the parts of the world that are hurting. And so we all feel their pain. But what if those are not the parts that are hurting? What if they're not the weak ones? What if it's us? What if it's the Muslim American community or privileged communities throughout the world that have access to power, that have a voice, that can construct their own narratives and are not doing it? When you think about giving to organizations like the American Muslim Institution and this project of amplifying voices, I want you to think about actually redefining the part that's in pain. Because what we also know in the Islamic tradition is pain that's felt throughout the body, love is also felt throughout the body. And what we need today are institutions, organizations like this that are amplifying Muslim voices so that the parts of the world that are hurting are heard, because our voices are there to ensure that the voiceless are heard. And so that's the kind of breaking the narrative of Islamophobia, breaking the Islamophobia industry that has in many ways tried to attack our sense of self-identity and how we belong in the United States, and saying, no, not in our name. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahmy. That was an enlightening presentation, and I appreciate not only your support of AMI, but how you continue to uplift our community with facts and knowledge. Thanks for also agreeing to take a few questions from our audience. I could not help but write down some of the very important points that you mentioned, and I think are reiterating not only for myself, but also for the audience. Firstly, you touched on the role of hate speech in getting people elected. And then all of a sudden, when those individuals, especially you specifically mentioned the Tea Party, they get elected, they oftentimes forget about Sharia law. It seems like we've gone from a securitization lens to now a politicalization lens. It's a very frightening trend. But also, you were quite optimistic, and I really appreciated that. And I quote, you mentioned, youth become the great equalizers, and they are changing the narrative and writing their own story. Now I'd like to take a moment and take a little executive privilege and build on this idea of shaping narrative with the first question. Do you believe the media has a role in perpetuating Islamophobia? And also, how would you describe the media? I know there are quite a few definitions, and I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I actually wrote a report on this for the Atlantic Council, and in a forthcoming publication, I'll expand on it more. What we've seen in the past decade is that the definition of media has shifted. If you remember when President Trump was elected and Steve Bannon went into the White House, you saw an elevation of what used to be marginal and fringe news organizations like Breitbart become mainstreamed. And what the industry has started to do is that once articles are published in these marginal, unfounded kind of claim organizations, they're elevated to media and then recycled throughout the media with quotes. And so you saw the definition of what is mainstream media come to envelope many marginal organizations. And so what this did, especially in the era of social media and retweeting and Facebook and WhatsApp mass messaging, is that information is disseminated that is completely unfounded. And it's led to the mainstreaming of complete falsehoods. The industry, coupled with financiers that have political objectives, in many ways have taken advantage of this opening. We've seen a little bit of regulation in the past couple of months with, for example, social media platforms flagging certain articles for not being truthful. But if you think about what the effects are, the damage in many ways is already done. So absolutely the media has a responsibility, not just to talk, to do their due diligence, but to ensure that the marginal stay marginal and that the mainstream remains mainstream. But on the other hand, when we talk about issues that touch the Muslim American communities, and you think about the pundits that come on TV, one study that was released finds that 89% of pundits are neither Muslim or tied to the Muslim community. And so there's almost a complicitness of not giving voice to those that are actually in the industry. But we've seen a shift in this. For example, on MSNBC, we have Ali Velshi, Mehdi Hassan, Ayman Mohideen, and also more people being hosted on different talk shows for expert analysis. So yes, in many ways, the media has a very large responsibility, but it's that intersection between media and those with political objectives and funding that have led to what used to be marginal to become mainstream in the past decade.
That's such an interesting concept, Dr. Fahmy. So what you're saying, it's the marriage of politicians and the media who have allowed the fringe to become the mainstream. And it happened right under our nose. Thanks. So at this time, I'd like to invite our next questionnaire. Anissa Johnson, you're up.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Fahmy. Thank you for speaking about such important issues. I wanted to ask, what suggestions, strategies do you have for Muslim Americans to work with other marginalized communities?
I think one of the challenges of, let's talk first for a few minutes about the Muslim American immigrant community, is being stuck in thinking that it's an immigrant community and that the legacy of Islam and Muslims remains, which leads to an erasure of the very long legacy of African American Islam in this country. And so in many ways, the first step is to recognize the long, rich history of Islam in this country and tying the two narratives to one another, because they're both important. And one should erase the other, which unfortunately has been the case. But on the other hand, when we think about what are Muslim issues are healthcare, ensuring that the poor are taken care of, that the hungry are fed, that there's equal access to education. In many ways, we haven't collectively as a community framed Muslim issues in that regard. And we think about Muslim issues being human issues, which essentially is what our faith tells us in the ethics of Islamic jurisprudence, is that that's where we need to get our kind of ethical foundation, is that, again, Muslim issues are fundamentally tied to human issues, which are tied to alleviation of poverty, eradication of injustice, ensuring that everyone has equal access to education, and increasingly today, equal access to healthcare.
For the final question, we have Isa Basi. Go ahead, please.
While the theme of today's program is Islamophobia in America, what are you most optimistic about for our community?
That's a wonderful question. I'm most optimistic that the answer to a lot of what's happened in the past 5 years is that many more Muslims are running for office. If you think about this kind of fear nexus that started in the run-up to the 2016 election, it was almost creating a moment where it was like Muslims stay home, but the response was Muslims actually went out to the extent of running for office. And the segment that ran for office, 70% of those that ran for office were Muslim women, visibly Muslim women, who are saying, I'm going to reclaim my identity and take it to the highest levels of power. But also we saw an explosion of Muslims in the media and Muslim analysts, and Muslims actually changing, or investing their majors to study things like political science, things like journalism, but also moving in industries that, what does it mean to, for example, to work for the government in different venues and different agencies, and being visibly Muslim, but simply because you're American and that you believe in these American ideals. And I think one of the beauties in this is that in spite of increasing hate crimes, it was also an opportunity to increase the conversation. And for example, here in the state of New Jersey, where I live, you saw an uptick in anti-Semitic hate crimes, as well as anti-Muslim hate crimes. But it also led to a conversation of how we collectively as communities can start to combat this. So what I'm most optimistic about, even in the era of increasing hate and white nationalism and the international white power movement, is that communities are coming together and saying, we're going to redefine what it means to be American, and it's going to include all of us, and we're going to harken back to those American ideals. But as the Muslim American community continues to mature and grow, elevating voices in industries that are traditionally not medicine and engineering, but moving forward in these really important power kind of move industries, I think is critical. But for me, again, the most refreshing response to the rising anti-Muslim hate in the era of Trump was how many Muslims ran for office and how many of them were women.
Do you feel, as a follow-up question, with all of those who ran for office, do you feel that with the added representation in the media of Muslims, be it male or female, that we have noticed a decrease or should I say, less of that vitriol to American Muslims? Has it changed, or has it remained the same or gone down?
I mean, there's a couple of things that we're talking about, years of vitriol, and the consequences of which we still don't know, we still can't measure, and it's going to take a very long time to even curtail that to go back to point zero. But think about what the presence of, let's say you simply work in a newsroom. Think about what the presence of a Muslim in a newsroom where you're doing fact checking and you're thinking, wait, I know that there's another take on this story. Who can I ask? And I can go out into the field and say, who are experts on this, who are also Muslims, who are studying and writing on this? Your simple presence in the newsroom offers an alternate point of view, an increased data point that actually strengthens the integrity of journalism. And so I think that is the most important thing. The presence of individuals at these tables where stories are written and decisions are made brings in a point of view that ensures that what is actually collected is closer to the truth.